Before we start, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Give us a like and share it with your friends and family. Also, please, can you tell me from where and what time you watching? Thanks. The drowned below. The sea was not merely a vast expanse of water. It was a vault of secrets, ancient and cruel. To those who dared venture into its depths, it offered no mercy. Only whispers of the unknown and horrors unimaginable. For Captain Elias Grayson and the crew of the trawler Mariana's Grace, the sea would reveal one of its darkest truths. The trawler had set sail from the port town of St. Magnus, a windswept village perched on the edge of the Atlantic. The mission was simple: survey a newly discovered undersea plateau near the infamous Devil's Abyss, a trench so deep that even modern sonar technology struggled to map its floor. Local fishermen spoke of strange catches and sightings near the trench, impossibly large shadows moving beneath their boats, nets filled with unrecognizable creatures. The Mariana's Grace was hired by a private research company to investigate. Elias had laughed off the superstitions. He had been a sailor for over 30 years and he knew the ocean's tricks. But as they sailed toward the coordinates, unease settled over the crew. The waters around the Devil's Abyss were unnaturally still. The usual chatter of seabirds absent. Even the waves seemed muted, as if the ocean itself held its breath. By the second day, they reached the plateau. The crew deployed the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, Neptune's Eye, equipped with high-resolution cameras and sampling equipment. The first images sent back from the ROV were stunning. Towering spires of black basalt rose from the seabed, covered in phosphorescent algae that glowed like ghostly flames. "It's beautiful," whispered Dr. Naomi Vance, the ship's marine biologist. She had joined the expedition with dreams of discovering new species, and already her notebook was filled with sketches of the strange fish and crustaceans captured on camera. Elias leaned over her shoulder, studying the monitor. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a shadow that flitted across the screen. Naomi frowned. "It's hard to say. Maybe a shark?" And Bede groaned. "No, it's gotta be a..." But it was no shark. The shadow moved too fluidly, too deliberately, disappearing into the darkness before they could get a clearer look. That night, the first incident occurred. Mateo, the youngest crew member, was on deck checking the nets when he saw something in the water. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a faint glow beneath the waves. But then it moved, rising toward the surface with it. "Captain! Something's out there!" he shouted. Elias and the others rushed to the deck, but by the time they arrived, the glow had vanished. Mateo's face was pale, his hands trembling. It looked like a face," he stammered. "A human face, but wrong, twisted." The crew dismissed it as nerves, but Mateo refused to go back on deck that night. The following morning, they retrieved the ROV. Its collection chamber was filled with samples of the glowing algae, as well as a strange artifact, a small, barnacle-encrusted idol carved from black stone. It depicted a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and an angular, featureless face. Naomi examined it carefully. "This is incredible. It looks ancient, but there's no record of any civilizations in this region capable of crafting something like this. Depending on what we're looking for." Mateo, who had been watching from a distance, muttered, "We should throw it back." Elias smirked. But as the day wore on, the atmosphere aboard the Mariana's Grace grew heavy. The crew became irritable, snapping at each other over minor disagreements. The hum of the engine seemed louder, more oppressive. And then there were the voices. Naomi was the first to hear them. She was reviewing footage from the ROV in her cabin when she heard a faint whisper. She looked around, but the room was empty. "Hello?" she called out. The whisper came again, this time clear. "Below. Join us. Below." Her heart raced. She checked the door, ensuring it was locked, and turned up the volume on her headphones to drown out the sound. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. And, as usual, by nightfall others began to hear them too. Matteo refused to leave his bunk, muttering prayers under his breath. The ship's engineer Carter reported hearing footsteps in the engine room when he was alone. "This place is cursed," Carter said, his voice grim. "We've brought something back that doesn't belong here." Elias dismissed their fears, but even he couldn't ignore the oppressive feeling that seemed to grip the ship. Sleep became impossible, the whispers filling their dreams with images of drowning and darkness. On the fourth day, they deployed the ROV again, hoping to distract themselves with work. This time, it descended deeper into the trench, beyond the plateau. The cameras captured haunting images of the abyss, skeletal remains of whales, their bones picked clean, and strange, serpentine creatures that darted out of view as the ROV's lights passed over them. And then, the signal cut out. "What happened, Elias?" demanded. Naomi frantically checked the controls. "I don't know, it's like something severed the tether." A low groan reverberated through the ship as if the ocean itself were alive and angry. The crew gathered on deck, staring at the water. The glow Matteo had seen earlier returned, but this time, it surrounded the ship. Shapes moved within it, circling like predators. "We need to leave," Carter said. "Now." Elias nodded. "Start the engines." But the engines wouldn't start. That night, Naomi disappeared. Her cabin was empty, the door wide open. A trail of wet footprints led from her room to the deck. Elias and the crew searched the ship, but there was no sign of her. Naolis and the crew searched the ship, but there was no sign of her. "She's gone!" Matteo said, his voice shaking. "They took her." Elias refused to believe it. "We'll find her. She's probably just..." But he couldn't finish the sentence. Deep down, he knew the truth. As dawn broke, the glow around the ship intensified. The shapes in the water became clearer. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs and empty, glowing eyes. They rose from the depths, climbing onto the deck with inhuman grace. The crew fought back, but it was futile. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, dragging men into the water one by one. Elias managed to lock himself in the wheelhouse, his heart pounding as he watched the carnage below. Matteo's screams were the last to fade. Hours passed. The whispers filled the wheelhouse, louder than ever. Elias clutched the black idol, hoping, praying that destroying it would end the nightmare. He hurled it against the wall, shattering it into pieces. The whispers stopped. The glow faded. The ocean was silent once more. Elias stumbled onto the deck. The ship was empty, the bodies of his crew gone. The water was calm, the sky clear, as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. The sea had claimed them. When the Mariana's Grace was found drifting weeks later, Elias was the only one aboard. His hair had turned white, his eyes hollow. He spoke of the creatures, of the voices, of the abyss that called to him still. The black idol was gone, but its curse remained. Those who ventured near the devil's abyss reported hearing whispers, feeling eyes watching them from the deep. And on quiet nights, when the ocean was still, some swore they saw the glow beneath the waves, circling, waiting. The abyssal call. It was supposed to be an ordinary research expedition. The Endeavor, a state-of-the-art research vessel, had set sail from the bustling port of San Francisco, bound for an unexplored region of the Pacific Ocean. Funded by the prestigious Oceanic Exploration Institute, the team aboard was tasked with mapping the depths of the ocean trench known only as the Veil. It was a place where sunlight never penetrated, and its depths were thought to be uninhabitable by any known life. But the ocean had its secrets, and the Veil was not what it seemed. Dr. Evelyn Carter stood on the deck of the Endeavor, the salty breeze tossing her auburn hair. The marine biologist had dreamed of this moment for years. At 34, she was one of the youngest scientists ever to lead such an ambitious expedition. Her specialty was deep-sea ecosystems, and she had been chosen for her innovative theories on life's resilience in extreme environments. "We'll make history," she had said during the pre-launch briefing, but even then there was a note of trepidation in her voice. The Veil was uncharted for a reason. The stories surrounding it, whispered among sailors and dismissed by scientists, were unsettling. "They say it's cursed," one of the deckhands, Mateo, had muttered as they loaded equipment. Evelyn had laughed it off, but the way his eyes darted nervously to the horizon stuck with her. By the fourth day at sea, they reached the coordinates of the Veil. The crew busied themselves preparing the submersible Abyssal for its first descent. The craft was designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep ocean and was equipped with high-resolution cameras, robotic arms, and an array of sensors. "Ready for the dive?" asked Captain Harlow, a grizzled man with decades of maritime experience. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. Evelyn nodded. "Let's see what's down there." As the submersible was lowered into the water, Evelyn and her co-pilot, Dr. Samir Patel, climbed into the cramped cockpit. The hum of the machinery filled the space as they began their descent. The surface light faded quickly, replaced by an inky darkness that pressed against the craft like a living thing. At 3,000 meters, the ocean was a silent void. The only sound was the occasional groan of the submersible's hull as it adjusted to the immense pressure. Evelyn's eyes were fixed on the monitor displaying the external camera feed. Strange, bioluminescent creatures flickered in and out of view, their ghostly forms alien and beautiful. "We're nearing 6,000 meters, Samir reported. "Sensors are picking up something unusual." Evelyn leaned closer. The sonar showed a massive structure, far larger than any natural formation should be. It was a jagged spire rising from the trench floor, its surface covered in a strange, coral-like growth that seemed to pulse faintly. "What is that?" Evelyn whispered. Samir shook his head. "No idea. I've never seen anything like it." As they approached, the submersible's lights illuminated the spire's surface. The coral-like growths writhed as though alive, and faint symbols were etched into the stone, their patterns eerily symmetrical. Evelyn's heart raced. "We need a sample," she said. The robotic arm extended, carefully breaking off a fragment of the growth. As the claw retracted, the lights flickered. A low, resonant hum filled the cockpit, and the submersible shook violently. "Boy! What the hell?" Samir shouted, gripping the controls. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their very bones. Evelyn glanced at the monitor and froze. Shadows moved in the darkness beyond the spire, massive shapes that defied logic. They seemed to glide effortlessly, their forms indistinct, but undeniably alive. "We need to ascend." "Now," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. Samir didn't argue. The submersible began its ascent, but the shadows followed, their movements deliberate. The hum grew deafening, and Evelyn felt a pressure in her chest, as though something was pulling her toward the abyss. When they surfaced, the crew's relief was palpable, but the fragment they brought back was unlike anything they had ever seen. Under the microscope, its structure defied natural classification. It pulsed faintly, emitting a low-frequency vibration that set teeth on edge. That night, Evelyn dreamed of the spire. In her dream, she stood on the ocean floor, staring up at the massive structure. The symbols glowed, and a voice whispered in her mind, ancient and incomprehensible. When she woke, her heart was racing, and she could still hear the faint hum in her ears. Over the next few days, the crew began to change. Mateo, normally cheerful, grew withdrawn and sullen. Others reported vivid nightmares of drowning and shadowy figures. The hum, once faint, now seemed to emanate from the fragment at all hours. A constant, maddening presence. "We need to get rid of it," Captain Harlow said, his face pale. "That thing?" Evelyn protested. "We've barely begun to study it. This could be the discovery of the century. It is tearing us apart." Harlow snapped. "Look at your crew." Evelyn couldn't deny it. Tensions were high and the once cohesive team was fracturing. Even she wasn't immune. The dreams had grown worse, and she often found herself staring at the fragment for hours, unable to look away. On the 7th night, the storm hit. Waves battered the Endeavor, and lightning illuminated the heaving ocean. Evelyn was in the lab studying the fragment when she felt it. A presence in the room. She turned, and for a moment, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, its form indistinct, but its hollow eyes unmistakable. She screamed, and the figure vanished. The fragment pulsed violently, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. The ship lurched, and Evelyn was thrown to the floor. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to stabilize the vessel, but it was too late. The Endeavor sank in the early hours of the morning. Evelyn awoke to freezing water filling the lab. She scrambled to the surface, clutching a life vest, and found herself adrift in the open ocean. Around her, the wreckage of the ship floated, but there was no sign of the crew. Hours passed, the sun rose, but the warmth did little to chase away the chill in her bones. As the day stretched into night, she drifted, the endless horizon offering no solace. Then she heard it, the hum. It started faint, barely audible over the lapping waves, but it grew steadily louder, and with it came the shadows. As darkness fell, the shadows surfaced. They were massive, their forms shrouded in a darkness that defied the moonlight. One rose before her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Its hollow eyes locking onto hers. A voice echoed in her mind, deep and resonant. "You are chosen." Evelyn screamed as the water beneath her churned violently. The shadows closed in, and the last thing she saw was the spire, glowing faintly beneath the waves, its symbols pulsing with an ancient, malevolent rhythm. When a fishing vessel found her weeks later, she was adrift in a lifeboat clutching a piece of coral-like growth. Her eyes were vacant, her mind shattered. The abyss calls. The fragment was confiscated by authorities, but rumors spread of strange occurrences surrounding it. Those who came into contact with it reported hearing a faint hum and dreaming of shadows. And somewhere in the Pacific, the veil waited, its secrets still buried in the depths, calling to those who dared to listen. The Whispering Shadows. It began with a single photograph. The image was found tucked inside an old leather-bound book that Rachel had picked up from a dusty corner of the antique shop. The book, titled Mysteries of the Forgotten, had called to her from a crooked shelf. It wasn't the title or the intricate silver embossing on its cover, but the feeling, a strange pull, as though the book had been waiting for her. The photograph slipped out as Rachel flipped through the brittle pages that smelled of decay and time. The image was peculiar. A large, decrepit mansion shrouded in mist. The house looked abandoned, its windows like hollow eyes staring into an unseen void. In the corner of the photo, written in faint, spidery handwriting, was a date: October 31, 1927. Rachel felt a shiver. despite the warm sunlight streaming through the shop's windows. She slipped the photo back into the book and bought it without further thought. Something about that house fascinated her. The cashier, an old man with rheumy eyes, said nothing as he bagged her purchase, but his hands trembled slightly as they brushed the photograph. Rachel was a writer, or at least she used to be. After months of writer's block and a string of failed pitches, she had retreated to her family's cabin in the small town of Ash Grove, hoping the solitude would bring inspiration. But the cabin's walls seemed to close in on her as the days stretched into weeks, her notebook remaining frustratingly blank. When she returned to the cabin with the antique book in hand, something shifted. She couldn't stop thinking about the house in the photograph. Where was it? Did it still exist? And who had taken the picture? Curiosity turned into obsession. She searched for any clues in the book but found nothing about the house. Frustrated but determined, Rachel took to the internet. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon a forum discussing haunted locations in the state. Buried in a thread was a reference to a place called Blackthorn Manor, abandoned since the late 1920s. Her heart raced as she read on. The manor was notorious, not just for its eerie architecture, but for the dark history surrounding it. Blackthorn Manor had once been the home of the wealthy Thorn family, who vanished without a trace one Halloween night. The disappearance was never solved, and rumors of curses and ghosts had plagued the property ever since. Rachel's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. Blackthorn Manor was only 2 hours away from Ash Grove. The drive was uneventful, though the further she got from Ash Grove, the more isolated the roads became. By the time Rachel reached the overgrown driveway leading to Blackthorn Manor, the sun was a pale orb sinking behind dense, gnarled trees. The house loomed at the end of the driveway, its decaying facade even more sinister in person. Vines choked the walls, and the once gray porch sagged under years of neglect. But it was the windows that unsettled Rachel the most. Just like in the photograph, they looked like hollow eyes watching her approach. She parked her car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnameable tension. As she stood before the house, a whisper of doubt crept into her mind. This was insane. She should leave. But something, perhaps the same pull that had led her to the book, urged her forward. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of mildew and rot. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like ghostly veils in the corners. Rachel's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a grand staircase, its banister warped and splintered with age. She explored cautiously, each step stirring up motes of dust that danced in the beam of her light. The rooms were a strange mix of grandeur and decay. Crystal chandeliers hung above floors littered with debris. Ornate wallpaper peeled to reveal bare, crumbling plaster beneath. In the library, she found a desk with a cracked leather chair. On the desk lay an open journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. As Rachel read, her blood turned to ice. October 30th, 1927. The whispers are growing louder. They call to us in the dead of night, promising answers but demanding something in return. Edward insists we stay, but I am terrified. Something is wrong with this house. October 31st, 1927. They came for us. The entry ended abruptly, the final line smeared, as though the writer had been dragged away mid-sentence. A loud crash echoed from upstairs. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. She froze, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, she heard it. A whisper. Rachel's first instinct was to leave, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo from every direction. Against her better judgment, she climbed the staircase, her flashlight flickering as though struggling to stay alive. The upper floor was even more decrepit. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the air was icy. Pushing the door open, Rachel stepped inside. The room was a bedroom, its furniture draped in white sheets that looked like specters in the dim light. At the center of the room stood a mirror, its surface tarnished, but reflecting her pale, trembling face. And behind her, Rachel spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. But when she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was still there. It was not her own. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, 1,000 voices overlapping, pleading, accusing. The shadow in the mirror grew, its form shifting into something almost human. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and Rachel felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed and bolted from the room, the whispers chasing her down the hallway. As she reached the staircase, the floor beneath her feet gave way. She fell, the world spinning as darkness swallowed her whole. Rachel awoke to darkness, her head throbbed, and her body ached. The flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam faint but steady. She reached for it, her hands trembling, and realized she was no longer in the house. She was in a cavernous space, the walls rough and damp. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Rachel's flashlight illuminated the space around her, revealing walls etched with symbols she didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it lay the photograph she had found. In the book, what the image had changed. The house was no longer empty. Figures stood in the windows, their faces pale and lifeless. And standing at the center of the photograph was a shadowy figure, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. This moment was thrilling, a tremendous voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the cavern. "He should not have come." Rachel turned, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the cavern. The figure from the photograph stood before her, its form shifting and pulsating like smoke. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, and Rachel felt a pull, as though her very soul was being drawn toward it. Desperation took over. Rachel grabbed the photograph from the altar and tore it in half. The figure let out a piercing scream, the cavern shaking violently as the walls began to crumble. Rocks fell around her, and she ran, her lungs burning as she searched for an exit. Just as the cavern collapsed entirely, she saw a sliver of light and threw herself toward it. She emerged into the forest, gasping for air, the whispers fading into silence behind her. Da-da-da-da. Rachel never returned to Blackthorn Manor. The photograph, now torn and blank, lay forgotten in a drawer. But the whispers followed her, haunting her dreams and echoing in the quiet corners of her life. And sometimes, when she looked into a mirror, she swore she could see hollow eyes watching her from the shadows.